opportunity to bring us all around the table and for Chris to share some of the data that that Microsoft has been gathering with TeacherTap over recently. Hi Toby, just kicking us off now. Nice to see you. So yeah, he's going to start us off by telling us a little bit about what we've been finding out in this report, but then really it's an opportunity to bring together what everyone's got to offer, and as I've sent out those 3 key questions I'm hoping for us to address, which are defining the issue, understanding what the problem is, which I'm sure we're all well aware of, but it'd be good to make sure we're all talking about the same things. And then thinking a little bit about how things have evolved over the last 6 to 9 months. I know back right at the start of lockdown, we held our first round table on the crisis and what it was going to mean, but things have changed quite a lot since then, and the situation's obviously evolved a lot. So it'll be really helpful to see what's changed and what the new issues are, which issues have diminished, which ones have grown, and then to think about both the immediate actions and how we lay foundations for the future. What I'm going to do is to try and keep it quite informal. So I'm happy for people to be unmuted so that you limit the difficulties with that unless you've got background noise, and feel free to kind of jump in quite informally as we go along, although I will kind of direct it a bit as chair, but I'm happy for people to interrupt and it won't and jump in. It won't be interpreted as rudeness. So yeah, without further ado, do you want to kick us off, Chris, and say a few words?
Yeah, sure. So really good to see all of you. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to try and give a sort of a whistle stop as to what the report is and why we've done it. I mean, I think all of us that, any of us that work with education will have seen that the last few months have been probably the most turbulent that the sector's ever had. I think I've yet to hear anybody give me an alternative of the more turbulent time they'd propose. And of course, a part of that, we've seen the sector really shift towards using technology in a way that hasn't been as broadly or deeply adopted previously. And that happened, of course, because there was no option. Schools, colleges, universities all closed. Everybody had to figure out where they were and how they could get, use technology in order to enable continued education. And then with this report, what we really wanted to do was to actually ask the teachers and the school leaders how that was going and what they kind of felt about the future a little bit as well. And so working with TeacherTap, we asked 5,000 educators, including a good chunk of school leaders, what their perceptions are and of how that technology has worked and what kind of needs to happen next and some of the challenges that they see. And so just drawing out some of the things that I think we've seen within the report. I mean, the first thing is that actually the teachers' attitudes towards technology are relatively positive. They definitely see the benefit that it can bring in terms of empowering pupils, which I think is quite a nice way to think about it. See it as a way that can build future skills, see it as a way that can empower more independent learning, and actually not that much difference between primary and secondary in that view. That there are definitely also challenges and differences in terms of how people see that technology coming to life and where they would prioritize it. So by stage of education, we see primary actually being more interested in moving towards a one-to-one device scheme, actually, which I think is perhaps wasn't what I would have expected, but kind of interesting to see that. And then also some really interesting variation by the subject that people teach. So English teachers, I think, would choose an interactive whiteboard of all of the options that they could choose. Humanities teachers wanted textbooks, and actually primary and art type subjects were those that were most likely to choose more sort of the device and technology type solutions to improve their education and their learning. So lots of good insight around what's working, the appetite, the potential for it to do more. But I think the other thing that the report really calls out is that there is a digital divide, and that is contributing to an achievement gap. And I think probably all of us in this forum here are not surprised by that when you hear it played back to you. I think that my own perception of seeing how the pandemic has played out, and particularly some of the way that the education sector has been reported in the press, is that it's shown the role that schools play from a social perspective as well as from an education perspective. And while that's been imperfect, of course, once you've taken away the physical environment of being in school, it's shown that kind of gap has been exacerbated, if you like, by the fact that the schooling hasn't been able to continue as normal. And then, of course, when you start to think that the education has largely shifted to digital access, then compounds that, and where pupils don't have access at home, either to a device that allows them to be able to learn in a focused way, or even to a connection that allows them to get online in order to be able to access that. I think there's plenty of stories of, shared device, limited access, limited availability to kind of participate fully in that environment. And that, I think, is drawn into quite stark relief between some of the differences that we see in the private sector versus the state sector. So private schools much more likely to have one-to-one, high quality access at home. And we saw, I think, the pace at which private sector schools tended to switch towards live lessons just taught at home was much faster than it's been in the state sector. In the state sector, we see much less likely that someone is going to have access to all of those things that enable them to be able to take part in a kind of a focused environment for learning using a device connectivity whilst they're at home. And so there's definitely a big topic around as technology becomes a bigger part of how education is delivered, and we should sort of think about how that plays out from once schools reopen fully and we have fewer restrictions and in our lives, and hopefully vaccines all come to deliver on all of our hopes and expectations. But there's definitely kind of that digital divide is something that is a key topic in the minds of a lot of educators. And I think that the other thing probably the last thing I'll comment on the report, and then perhaps I'll bring back to Loic, but I think that teachers absolutely recognise that technology is playing a role. It's here to stay. That hybrid education is likely to be, a big part of how the education sector works in the future. But they definitely also see challenges with that. Lots of educators are calling out that if we gave them one-to-one devices tomorrow, a good chunk of them still want training, would not feel comfortable. Actually, a really high proportion, I think, is around about the 50%. It varies a little bit by sector and or segment of education and by age of the educator. Lots of them are really delighted, like, fabulous, that's great, let's get on and do it. Still chunk that are worried about training. There are people that are concerned about the safeguarding implications and how they keep children safe in that environment, and also concerns about the sustainability in terms of price and funding, and the devices that do or don't break, and how those things get managed in the classroom. So I think that's hopefully just a little bit of a summary and a teaser of some of the things that we see in the report. I think it is important to recognise, the response from the sector has been unbelievable. We've seen this at Microsoft, where we saw incredible things being done with technology before COVID was had ever been heard of, and then over the subsequent months, the pace at which the sector has matured and changed and adapted, and we've seen people go from sort of asking really basic, like, how do I do that, to beginning to ask really interesting, nuanced questions around, like, what's the best approach for me to teach this? How, which is the right tool for me to engage these kind of learners in these kind of subjects? And so we've seen really kind of interesting and incredibly rapid progression of the way that technology has been engaged in the sector. And nobody has found this easy by a long, long way. But we also see that those that have been kind of further on that technology adoption path have found it easier, and they've had fewer barriers that they've needed to knock over in order to kind of successfully make that transition and think about kind of reimagining how they might teach and work as a result of that. So hopefully that kind of frames the discussion. Loic, I'll kind of hand back to you to guide us through from here, and please do shout if you feel like I've missed anything that you would want to highlight from the report as well.
Cool. No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Makes good sense. I was wondering whether I could pick on you, Kelly, just to say something about how this fits with the work that Teach First put out last week, and what you're finding in your experience.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of holding back shouting out, yes, exactly, as you're talking there, because I think so much of this echoes kind of the work we've been doing. Also with Teacher Tap, they're great, aren't they? For our ability to get hold of a good cross-section of what teachers are saying. Yes, at Teach First, both through that research that we put out last week, this really echoes kind of what you've talked about, and then also just from what we hear from teachers and school leaders day to day. Definitely. So in terms of the scale of the digital divide, the majority of teachers and school leaders are still reporting that they've got pupils in their schools who are not able to access suitable devices for studying at home, or struggle with internet access. So that's the majority of schools in disadvantaged areas are still facing that. I definitely would want to acknowledge the huge efforts that I think government have swung into action to try and start addressing that. I think good things are happening. All kinds of interesting factors are at play, which mean that might not be quick enough. Getting and making kit when everyone is trying to move to home working, I think, is a challenge. So I think good things are happening. The fact that yourself, Chris, you're here from Microsoft talking about this, lots of people are putting energy into this, but The fact remains that digital divide is still huge, and kids are missing out on learning as a result of that today. And we know that the effects of that could potentially last a lifetime without actions that's significant. And I was hearing head teachers earlier this week talk about things like, pupils whereby perhaps there's a laptop in the house, but might have one parent job sharing. There might be a kid doing their GCSE, so actually it might be the kid in primary school who doesn't get a looking, and it's not because the parents aren't trying to do their best, but in those circumstances it's really tough. So I can't wait to get my mitts on those primary results to see kind of what else might be in that as well, because I've got all kinds of theories. So definitely the problem is huge. Certainly what we're finding is that the schools who are in a good place, kind of particularly on leadership and management, are able to adapt to this well, and we've seen some really positive, brilliant practice in some of the disadvantaged areas, some great stuff happening across the country. Schools facing real challenges who aren't there yet are still struggling, and one of the things that they're reporting often is they do want that support, as you say, on embedding kind of blended learning in their school, and right down to really basic training themselves on how they manage that. So there's still obviously a great need there as well, and this isn't, lots of us have been talking about this for a long time. It's not a new problem, but I hope what this does is bring it into the spotlight, something that we can really address now. I'm kind of interested in this concept of, it becomes harder and harder to operate in the world if you're not online. Does internet and digital access become a basic utility in the way that we see other things? So I think that's going to be an interesting and an emerging question on that front. And I think lots of school leaders would like to take advantage of some of the great things that have happened in the past few months for the longer term, if the digital access gap could be closed. So things like, I'm speaking to a head teacher who was saying she would love to be able to set homework online for the long term, because engagement can be so much higher, and they can really help support pupils with studying at home if they're able to do that. Colleagues like Jonathan on the line at Oak National Academy, I'm sure will have great things to say on that too. But without that digital access, they're not going to be able to. So I really hope that this is a really good chance to tackle this head on, really.
Cool, thank you, Kelly. That's great. And I thought there were some useful bits in there in terms of this question of how exactly do we define this problem, because I think that this question of a pace and ability to adapt and how that's varied across different schools is certainly coming through in the figures in today's response. You mentioned that too, Chris. Does anyone want to come in with anything else on kind of defining the issue here? I can see Jonathan. You're on mute,
Jonathan.
That will be number 3 so far.
Classic mistake. Hey, look at that. There we go. Hello, everyone. For those who I don't know, I'm Jonathan, Director of External Relations at Oak National Academy. For those who I do know, hi, nice to see you all. So I kind of think there's in my head, there's 4 things we need. Then I think about what is the case for need, and then what's some of the solutions. So let me just break it down like that. So I think the 4 things that we need, and I started off doing 3 things we need, and I've now added a 4th to that. So number 1, if we're going to make remote blended online learning a thing, you need high quality resources. Those resources need to not just be things to keep kids busy online, but they need to be curriculum mapped and well structured and sequenced, that mean that they progress and they learn. It's not just they need to download something and it's fun and interactive. Things what's that learning progression for them. 2, they need a device. Kelly has talked about that, as has Chris. I won't say much about that, but what device matters as well as just a device. So at Oak, we see that about 25% of our use is on mobile, and we see lesson completion significantly less on a mobile device than it is on a laptop. Not surprising, because a mobile is literally designed to interrupt you and divert your attention with loads of things pinging here, left and centre. But it's on the debate on devices. It's not just a device; it's what device as well. And then the thing that we're doing a lot of work on is access to data and Wi-Fi. According to Ofcom, there are nearly a million children who only access the internet through 3G or 4G, so on their mobile data, and over 500,000 with no access to the internet at all. Think about that as a poor family. You're probably accessing your data on pay-as-you-go mobile. which means we're charging a poor family a lot more to access education than a richer family. And that's like what we do in gas and electric, where poor families have to pay on a meter and the rest of us don't. So like that's potentially super problematic. And the fourth one that I've added on this is like training and familiarity. So like one of the problems that we experienced in the first lockdown is like schools were scrambling around, like they might have had this VLE, but they'd never really used it. Parents didn't know what a VLE was. And so like just being familiar with this, one of the things that we've seen really good schools do with Oak this term is they've set Oak as homework from September to get parents and children used to using it. So then if and when a bubble bursts and that class needs to isolate, they know what they're doing, and there's no friction in that having to learn a new thing at a new time. So that's that. And then just quickly on other things, like, is this a problem and what's some of the solutions? Talked about like 1 million people only accessing internet through mobile data. Like the case for like remote education right now for COVID is very clear. We've got 500,000 people, 500,000 children using Oak every week. That's going up each week, but we're also seeing it used for other stuff. So homework, catch up, and let's think about this long-term agenda around like tuition and catch up. If poor kids aren't able to do proper catch up because of access, which a lot of it's going to be done online, that's going to further exacerbate those gaps. And there's a whole bunch of people who can't normally be in a school because of long-term exclusion, because of sickness, they're in hospital education, they're in the youth justice estate, all of that stuff. And the last thing, and I'll flash it up, is the bang that the drum that we're banging at Oak is there's been lots of good noises about devices, really positive stuff there. There's been some good noises around data uplifts for poor families, but they're like temporary and capped. 2 weeks isolation using Oak requires 10 gigabytes of data. Your data uplift very quickly runs out. There is a simple solution which is called zero rating, where you make certain websites data free, and like there's a big argument that we are pushing very hard that educational sites should be data free to use. Okay. And that's my tuppence.
Cool. Thank you. Cheers for that, Jonathan. And from Jonathan to Johnny, I know that you've been doing a lot of work actually defining this issue and defining what people need. So it'd be really helpful to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, it's little what I've been doing in a way, but what I've realised, I worked with some schools in the summer, and we started because they needed laptops, and everyone was asking, well, how many do you need? So, and there wasn't a straight answer to that. Nobody really knew, and so what we had to do is start collecting data, and we came up with a questionnaire. And what I think we learned is that that's something that is not just the case in those schools, but there's no systematic way in which data is properly collected. And I put my hand up because I was just wanting to build on what Jonathan was saying. I mean, a lot of this thing about children using mobiles, you know, that shouldn't count, I don't think, as proper access. And so you can discount them. And then even the Ofcom numbers, well, what they missed and what people learned over the summer through the data collection was that so many families are sharing devices. So there's especially in the extreme lockdown situation, there's like competition for devices. But to my mind, I don't know, you can pick your age, but every secondary school kid really should have their own proper device if we're going to have, and so that is where, and in order to say, well, how near are we to that? And we really need a good picture of the data collection. What I think is that schools actually are quite motivated to collect that data themselves. They need to know, they want to know, so they just need a simple mechanism. So what I'm working on or trying to start to build in one way or another is that kind of platform, so that schools can know the right questions to ask, and that was also mentioned just as I joined the course, so I was a bit late, but defining which device is needed is part of the question there. And before the whole COVID thing, I think the discussions I was involved in always went round and round in circles when it got to what device is really needed. That was slightly unlocked by DFE ordering a load of devices, and that kind of gave us at least something again. So that it may not be completely the right answer, but it is a laptop. We had a specification. We could start to help schools to gather, answers to questions and we worked to put these questions. I mean, one of the things that we do, and I think we made some progress on, is to frame those questions about the device specification in a way that teachers could have with families without it appearing very technical. And so we did a bit of work on that. Anyway, if we could get to a platform that allowed schools to easily collect the data, but also allowed the data to be open to policymakers and in fact also to businesses, then everyone could play their part. They could see the picture and everyone could play their part in finding a solution. That's where I am on this.
Thank you. Great. Cheers. Paul, I saw you wanted to come in.
Yeah. Hi. Love the conversation so far, and great to see a group together. I wanted to raise an issue which I think is fundamental to this. One of the great things about this meeting is the focus is clearly on education, because I think occasionally people get confused about providing access to kids to devices that they don't have at home and education. So it might best be described by my two hats, and I think we're all probably wearing two hats at the moment. My normal hat is chief executive of something called the Learning Foundation, and for 10 years or so, including support from Microsoft way back for the launch 20 years ago, we've been working on providing schools with support around introducing technology on, as you say, a one-to-one basis. Now that process will often take a year or more to put into place from the point at which they start discussing why they want to introduce technology, what are the reasons for doing that, and then going through the process of funding it and training teachers, and then finally the last, and involving parents and school kids in all of that kind of conversation. And the final part of that process, which, as I say, often takes more than a year, is the device being handed to the child. At that point, everybody knows that that device is for learning, it's for use across the curriculum, it's for use in school, and it's used for taking home to continue their learning at home. What the DFE, so now what we found was that schools were just not taking it up as quickly as they ought to, the state sector particularly, which is where we work exclusively. Not because they can't or they're not interested, just because funding and Ofsted meetings and everything else just meant that they had too few resources and understanding and language and all of those kind of things, which you'll all understand, means they haven't taken it up. Nonetheless, what we found was that vast numbers of children, and Digital Access for All launched with the help of Microsoft and others 18 months ago now, was that large numbers of children were not connected at home at all. And at the time, people were surprised about that. Some people thought all the data seemed to point out the fact that every home is connected. And if you ask ONS, that's what they would say. But the reality, as we all know, is something substantially different. Now, the reason we launched Digital Access for All is because we think all families and kids should be connected to the internet for all the reasons, for education, for life, for preparedness, for work and everything else. The issue I have with DFE right now, and I am very clear with them about it, is that giving 1 million, and by the way, that's their current plan, is to give 1 million devices by the end of February next year, which I think is pie in the sky, but that's their ambition of the department, and apparently has clearance from Treasury on this. And the idea is that everybody essentially on free school meals between year 3 in primary schools, which is a delight. Chris, I agree with you completely. I love the fact that primary schools, often they are the most open to these discussions that we have with Learning Foundation, up to year 13. So they've got some big ambitions, but what I'm saying to them is giving the children a laptop, albeit through a conduit, their school as a conduit, is not going to translate into an uplift in attainment. He is not going to close the attainment gap. For some it will, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing on its own. I think kids and families in that way is a big step forward for lots of different reasons, for life and preparedness for work and everything else. But it is not going to uplift education. Too few schools in the UK currently have any way. What's going to happen is that once they're all connected, schools are going to send them PDFs, aren't they? As they did during they're going to send them copies of documents for the kids to read. They are not going to. It's not going to be about using technology to deliver enhanced learning, and that's the prize to be had. And I'm very, very worried right now that the investment, the millions of pounds investment of time and money that DFE is not going to translate into the kind of educational change that we all want to see. So I see this as not a short-term problem and not just about digital access. It's about how we deliver learning in the future, and that is a 3 to 5 year program, even if the government step forward amongst Brexit and COVID and everything else to drive this forward. They are not interested in leading in this, by the way. I know they've got an Edtech strategy coming up at the moment, but there is no interest in them driving this. And so that's a fundamental issue. I'll stop talking now, but I wanted to throw that into the pot.
No, and I think your point about effective deployment is certainly a familiar one. I've actually got a piece in Schools Week tomorrow, and thinking back to, I remember when I was teaching and the use of the interactive whiteboards we had at the time, which ended up just being very expensive projectors, right? Because they weren't, the deployment wasn't right. So in some ways we've started to touch on some of the questions around how the situation has evolved over the last 6 to 9 months in terms of moving the conversation from just having something towards having something that's adequate that meets the quality criteria, around building familiarity, deploying effectively, and thinking a little bit more about data than perhaps that we were at the start. I'm going to turn to Seb. I know that you've been doing some work on that, and then bounce back to Chris and Toby. That's all right.
Thanks, Luke, and hi everyone. My name is Sebastian. I by training I'm a head teacher, primary head teacher, and I currently work for Citizens UK, which is an alliance of organisations across the whole of the UK. All together, we work with about 200 schools, and many of them are in quite difficult areas. So many of them have struggled through the crisis in terms of digital access. And I guess I'm not going to say anything new to what's already been said. Building Johnny and Paul have just said, what we've noticed is that data collection is really important, and Johnny made a really good point on that. Sometimes people will say there are devices available, but if you've got one device between 3, that's not equal access. So therefore how we collect data is really important. If you've got food on one plate, this is not food for the whole family. This is food for one person. The same with with devices. Something else which we've noticed, especially in places where multi-academy trusts or groups of schools aren't very present, is that schools working on their own are really struggling. When you've got large multi-academy trusts where there are resources and sort of internal capacity to get things done, it's worked really well, or it has worked, at times, very well. In places, particularly in rural areas where schools tend to work on their own, it's been really challenging. And there's been a big disparity between what secondary schools have managed to do and what primary schools have also managed to do. So that's another thing to take into account. But I get more positively, what we've also seen is that, well, I guess there are 3 sectors in society. We've got the civil society sector, we've got the state sector, and we've got the private sector. And we often argue that a healthy society is one where those 3 sectors work well together. And we know that the state is struggling. There is a lot going on which the government and the state sector is struggling with. We know that the civil society sector is also struggling. So what we would need to see, which we have seen in some places, is the private sector stepping in. And where we've seen private businesses, stepping in to either donate devices or provide data, that's really helped. I'm aware of partnerships in some regions, like around Greater Manchester, where Media City has really helped as a sort of umbrella body to to support local schools with donations of devices as well as data, which has really helped. So I guess moving forward and looking at potential solutions, I think it'd be quite useful to have a conversation around how do we rebalance the balance of power, as it were, between the state, the private sector, and the civil society sector. So the 3 understand each other's needs, but also step in as and when needed. Because when it does happen, we see wonderful things. And Oak Academy is a wonderful example in case. The state has been involved, the private sector has been involved, and the schools have benefited from this. So that would be well, I guess it is a recommendation, but it would be a something to think about in terms of how do we get the 3 sectors to work more closely together.
Thanks, Seb and Matt. Yeah, I think we'll close off later by coming back to those different parts of those different sectors and how they all fit together. So that's helpful in terms of framing that. and also really helpful to have that practical example of what's going on in Manchester. Toby, can I turn to you?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Toby Baker. I work for a charity called Nesta, yeah, I agree with lots of what's been said. I just wanted to follow on. I think it was Jonathan from Oak who was describing the sort of 4 component parts, and his 4th one really resonated with our work recently. So, you know, even once you've got your device, you've got your high quality resources, you've got willingness, you know, unless teachers have an understanding of how their VLE works or parents have heard of it, etc., then it isn't going to go to plan. So essentially, we know that effectiveness is really dependent on strong, consistent implementation. And I just wanted to underline 2 points that I think sometimes get a bit overlooked in this implementation question around digital divide. The first is it's really important that we're defining what particular form of disadvantage is leading to that digital divide. You know, is it access to a device? Is it access to Wi-Fi? Is it a space at home in which to work? Or is it that an Edtech tool isn't designed very well for you? Is it low motivation, etc.? So lots of those issues might happen at a school level, at a family level, at an Edtech platform level. But unless we're really clear about where and how we want to make improvements, then it's unlikely to address a specific educational disadvantage as opposed to a more generic form of digital divide. And then the second thing that resonated on you know, how do we do implementation really well? We are working at the moment on a program called the Edtech R&D Fund, but it's essentially funding for schools and Edtech tools to collaborate with each other as part of a formative evaluation. I think one of the questions is always, you know, when we want better collaboration with schools, how can we do that in a way which is beneficial for all, particularly during a hugely difficult year when, frankly, staff in schools have got enough to be thinking about without an additional ask that they collaborate and share their learnings, etc. But I think 2 things have stood out for us as we're trying to do that at the moment. One is the importance of all of this work being as formative as possible, and formative in real time. So ensuring that we see the benefits of collaboration as early as possible, rather than submit a survey, find out 3 months later, see a synthesis of that survey 3 months later, you know, really actionable insights as we go along. And then secondly, we found it really important to structure those benefits on both sides very explicitly and be unapologetic about that. So the benefits of collaboration for Edtech tools, you know, hopefully we can improve the technology tools and ensure that they are more impactful. And for schools, you know, challenging ourselves to give them really targeted insights about, it might be a specific class cohort, it might be a specific department, etc., however we can be useful. And then also sharing findings from other schools with schools that we're working with. So to flag, you know, those 2 things, and as I said, we're kind of trying to do this at the moment, and we can share our experience of how it's going and how it will have gone pretty shortly in a couple of months' time.
Thank you. And yeah, our team is certainly really enjoying working on that evaluation. So it's really good to be partnering on that. Good. I think let's move on to really dig now into that question of responding to these issues now that we've got a sense of them. I really like that additional of the problem definition, Toby, around the different types of disadvantage people are facing rather than seeing it just as one form. And I think that point about space as well, we've certainly seen in a lot of the research we've been doing that people being piled into small spaces and having to have some of the family working there, several of the people doing their school work and so on, is a really important form of disadvantage that's playing a role here. Chris, do you want to kick us off with some reflections on what these different stakeholders, we've talked about civil society, the state, private sector and schools, and your sense of what different stakeholders need to bring to a table here to address some of these issues.
Yeah, actually, I was going to reflect on something slightly different. I might come back to that. So, just thinking about, I really like the way that the conversation evolved into sort of thinking about there's a set of things that we all want to do differently or enable differently to happen at home. And I thought Toby's comments around like there are different disadvantages in that home access that could be like I don't have any, or I don't have a space, or there's a whole set of different things to tackle there. But then there's also quite a lot that got talked about in terms of access in school. And of course, we're all hoping wildly that in the not too distant future, we'll have unfettered access to school environments again, be able to teach and learn very much as we once did. But I think there's a sense that we don't necessarily all want to go back to the way that we did it exactly before. We want to evolve and reimagine that. And I think there's actually quite a lot that still needs to be done in schools. We've kind of done this all out of process. We bought, I can't remember who it was that sort of said, devices at the very, very end of that year-long process. I think, Paul, you talked about that, and yet we've done devices first because that was the burning need. We sort of need to go back and talk about all the other things that are required to make those devices really, really sing in an education environment. And it's not about, everything suddenly being done on a laptop. It's about using technology where it helps people engage and access content and learn differently in conjunction with all of the amazing things you can do in a classroom, in a playing field with a teacher in the classroom. And so I was just going to comment that reflection of kind of thinking about those two sides of the discussion, I think is really interesting. And hopefully we're not going to be in a home learning environment forever, but we are going to be able to think about how we light up greater home access and parental engagement and extended learning alongside all the things that were always amazing about schools. So I think that was kind of really interesting to try and take the conversation there.
That's helpful, thank you. Yeah, and Joycey, could I bring you in there, because I know that this is something you've done years of work on, particularly at that junction between the different sectors and bringing people together. Do you want to say a little about how you see this, where you see some of the solutions?
Yeah, so, some of the points that were made around, the challenges have always existed, and it's not just about the unequal access to technology. It's also around the capabilities, the training for teachers, the parental engagement, and also understanding how the resources that are being put on these devices, whether it's really helping learning or hindering learning. So quite a lot of work that Nesta has done around building the case for evidence for technology, and we had launched something called an Edtech testbed while I was at Nesta, and due to the pandemic we had to pivot it, and now it's an Edtech R&D program where we're working. Nesta is working directly with the Edtech companies and schools. But in addition to that, I think some of the things that need to change or things that need to happen differently going forward, we've seen a tremendous amount of resourcefulness and resilience from both teachers and school leaders in responding to the crisis. But I think the real key thing is how things will look different, how education can be reimagined for the future, where technology becomes a core part of learning, and there's greater collaboration across what happens in school, but also what happens in home environment. Now everyone has been forced with home learning, but I think, as we all know, students spend a very small amount of time in school. So a lot of the things that happen in the community, in homes, also matters. And those kids from well-off backgrounds have that additional enrichment, whether it's the extra tuition or access to sports or drama or arts and other areas that disadvantaged kids don't have access to. So I think if I were to just summarize like 3 things that need to happen, the first thing would really be around across government, corporates, and civil society. So thinking about what are some interesting models, can we think of a different business model to finance some of this? Could there be more public-private partnership where, alongside government, business, and civil society coming together to fund some of the infrastructure requirement, but also the device requirement that we know that nearly 1 million kids don't have access to, both in terms of devices and connectivity. The second thing would be around data. So we know that tremendous amount of data is being generated through the use of technology during this time. And that can be used in interesting ways to understand what's working, what's not working. And if that data could be shared in a responsible way, such that you could use that data to then make predictions around, what are likely outcomes, where is support needed, how are disadvantaged kids faring compared to their well-off peers, and what sort of interventions would help them catch up with their learning. So I think the use of data in interesting ways, in a much more open and collaborative way, where different devices and different software talk to each other, so that there's a much more holistic view on the learning that's happening. And I think the final point is really around how do we make sure that there is support for learning and continuous professional development for teachers, so that as new technologies come to the fore, as new solutions are being implemented, they are able to adapt and continue to improve learning so that it meets the needs of the learners. So I think those are the three things that need to happen in order to make sure that we address this digital divide that exists.
Thanks so much. That's great. I think on that second point around using that data, I thought it was really helpful just a few weeks ago when No More Marking released the kind of data on the emerging evidence they're getting about where the learning gaps are emerging and the scale of that, which was, I thought, some of the first hard evidence we had about how all of this was playing out. So that is amazing, those kind of insights that can be released quite quickly from some of those platforms that are being used. Kelly, can I turn to you?
Yeah, and a couple of points I just wanted to pick up on there from Joyce. I agree with so much of what you were saying, and thinking about how we can, looking at the disparity between schools and between teachers on how they're able to support pupils both in school and at home, and the parental engagement side of it, and the differences between like well-supported schools, which are often in large academy chains that have the capacity to deal with this, and those that aren't. And one of kind of the core areas of our work at Teach First, we've had kind of more than 14,000 people come through one of our training programs now, and in any one year we're working with more than 1,000 schools in the most disadvantaged areas across the country, is really investing in and supporting those networks and connections between schools in those cold spots, if you like, where there isn't that same level of infrastructure and hubs of schools working together. And that's really important to us, that we're connecting those schools to help each other as well through this, so that when things, hopefully, the future looks bright, when things do start to go back to normal, that all this great progress isn't forgotten, but that you're kind of connecting the schools to continue to develop on this front. I think there's a really exciting opportunity there, and that networks point I think is really important. And just to make sure that in terms of like the long term, that support and training for teachers is really there. I think that's going to be really important in terms of addressing all types of the disadvantage that we're talking about here, and investing in developing those teachers to know how to kind of address this as the world starts to move on. We've got reason for hope again, another reason today with the ITT census out today and kind of teacher numbers. That's really encouraging. There's been real challenges in teacher recruitment for a long time, hitting hardest in some of the areas that we're talking about. Hopefully we'll see kind of capacity in schools grow, albeit that we're going to need to nurture them to make sure that they stay, and with the NAHT warning that kind of school leaders are really up against it at the moment. So if we've got some capacity in schools, let's think about how we really develop teachers to make the most of this for the long term, with support of all those kind of sectors across society. I think would be brilliant. Thank
you. Jonathan, can I ask what kind of shifts do you think would make a big difference in terms of things like Oak achieving their potential? You're on mute. Number 4.
Goodness me, come on. What amateur hour here,
It's
right?
so appropriate for a round table on tech.
So do you mean broader shifts to enable online learning to be, just to make sure I'm being precise in my answer?
Yeah, so if we think about those different stakeholder groups that we're looking at, schools, civil society, government and corporates, what kind of shifts could they make to support you in your work at Oak to have the biggest possible impact?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to those kind of things I may start a little bit again, but like there is this real question of how we want to use digital learning, right? I don't think we've actually solved that yet. Is it being used in the classroom as an aid to existing teaching and learning methods, and is it being used as a support for people who can't be in the classroom? Is it being used to extend learning? So, for example, you know, your school might not be able to offer Mandarin because they don't have a Mandarin teacher, but an online platform can. Or is it being used to kind of reinforce through catch up and homework? And I think like that's the kind of question that we need to kind of be solving to begin with. Like, what are we actually trying to do with this technology and this opportunity, and then building the infrastructure around those, because each of those requires different infrastructure and then different support. So I think that's the key. That for me is the first thing that we need to decide, because each of the solutions really depends on the problem we're trying to tackle. I think like the points around teacher training is really important, and that can't be just another thing that we throw into the ICT framework, right? Like it's like the school curriculum and Ofsted framework, right? Oh, there's something you want people to do, let's just throw it into there. So how do we do that in a sustainable way that is like long term and that supports teachers in that? But I think it also needs to be driven, as I say, like, I think all of this needs to be driven by schools, and I say this as someone working for an Edtech organisation, not by Edtech, because we have a self-interest, right? Like, and the risk with Edtech is too often it tries to take away or replace some of the activities of a teacher. Like, we're pretty clear, Oak, that the people who know what's best for a school and pupils are the teachers in a classroom. Right, and Edtech can only ever do a certain amount of that job, and so the school will know which solution is best to implement to solve the particular challenges that they have. And so it's therefore about making sure those school leaders, I think that's what comes to the crux of it, actually, I think about it now, speaking aloud, is like, how do we make sure the school leaders know about what the different opportunities are, and then how they go about solving them? Because something like Oak isn't going to work for a whole bunch of schools, and that's okay. But it is going to work for some schools, and the key is like, how do those kind of senior leaders in schools know which of the problems that Edtech can solve, and then how to go about implementing that effectively in their setting. I think that's probably my.
Yeah. Okay, cool, that's helpful. And yeah, I think some of the data in tomorrow's report actually might help with that to some extent, in terms of pointing to what teachers want from Edtech. You know, they talk a lot about the saving time on the planning and so on in order to free up time for teaching, and those kind of things coming to fore. I think also the recognition of a difference in appetite between subjects, like that took me by surprise, and I thought it was really interesting. You know, do we want to shove? Is it a case of shoving it down the throat of the teachers in the subjects that they don't have that appetite? No, probably not. It's much more about supporting those who are saying, actually, this, given what we're focusing on in our subject discipline and what the tech can do for us in our subject, then this is where we should be focusing our effort. I hope I haven't just stolen what you were going to say, Chris. Go ahead. No,
I was going to share. I did some extremely unscientific and anecdotal research a little while ago, where we were asking our innovative educator community what they see as blockers to technology adoption in schools. Hands down, the winner of my unscientific survey is school leadership, where teachers are saying, like, we want to do more, there are pockets of great stuff, and yet school leaders are actually not that supportive, and so they're not prioritizing. It's not part of how we run the school. And that really reflects then when I first started in this role, I started to visit some of our showcase schools. These are sort of like the leading institutions of doing great stuff with Microsoft technology. And before I went, I had this expectation I was going to see loads of amazing technology, and I was always surprised at how little technology I saw, and yet I was always really pleased to see actually how deeply integrated into the way the school ran the technology was. So it wasn't a big thing about having devices and laptops on every table or everybody sitting at a laptop screen. It was the way they smartly applied applications, process, data, workflow, automation to make teachers' lives easier and get the right resources to support learning in different ways. That's kind of like that. So I think that school leadership point, I think, is a really interesting one that definitely has got to be part of this rebuilding post-pandemic, to support those leaders who've had an extremely difficult time, but then also to think about, like, right now what? Like, how do I bring this to life in the long-term future of the school?
Cool, thank you. Great. And Seb, your hand is up, and we're starting to get towards the end. So if you want to get in there before we finish, then make yourself known. Seb, go ahead.
Thanks, Luke, and I guess that's my cue to be brief. I just wanted to build on Joyce's point around, public and private partnerships, which I sort of briefly talked about earlier. I think that is one of the ways forward, and we're seeing this sometimes done in three ways. Either it's a voluntary thing whereby, companies or private sector companies decide to be good neighbors and work very closely with the state, as in local authorities, and also their civil society neighbors like schools and faith organizations and so on. That is the ideal scenario where people respect each other as good neighbors. But sometimes partnerships also come in the form of tax reliefs, and it could be that companies are incentivized to help and get tax reliefs on that, or punishment, tax levy, whereby if you don't do the right thing, then we're going to tax you for not doing the right thing. So that's one way of looking at it, and we are seeing some of this in terms of the positive one, the voluntary partnerships. We're seeing one in, and I can't really say where it is because it's not been announced yet, but in Southwark, one of the largest housing developers has recently agreed to work with one of our schools to, as part of the development of a new council estate, to make sure that every home as part of those blocks will be given Wi-Fi. There will be Wi-Fi installed in the building, and that's where the state sector has managed to strike a deal with the private sector, and the civil society sector is going to benefit. And then finally, I guess what we're talking about here is digital poverty, which is one of the consequences of poverty in general. And some tech companies do pay the living wage, which means that cleaners and catering staff who would typically get about £8.50 an hour get paid over £10, and that's one way to solve poverty. If you're paying someone the living wage, then they don't need to have 2 or 3 jobs, which means that they can spend more time with their kids and support them with their learning, but also they can afford buying a laptop. And some companies like Google are paying the living wage, some companies aren't. So perhaps there's a bit of like, let's check what's going on within our private sector companies to make sure that those low-waged workers get taken out of poverty by being paid a more decent wage.
Thank you. Yeah, and really important to bring us back to that question of poverty, and to give all the organisations in the room a helpful nudge on what they can do on that front. Good. Any final comments before I wrap us up? Yeah, go on, Paul. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Hi. Yes, thank you. It's been completely fascinating. I think with my charity hat on, the 2 words that I'd like to focus on is equity and urgency. Absolutely, I've seen the change that technology properly applied can bring to primary school kids. Absolutely can change overnight their attitude to education, and means they go up to secondary school ready for learning. And that's where most of the youngsters who leave school functionally illiterate are already lost by the time they arrive at secondary school. All was an attempt to bringing groups of people together, including the third sector, and government is involved, but we've broadened it out. So we're just about to announce a partnership with the Institution of Engineering and Technology, who want to end digital poverty. So we will launch the Digital Poverty Alliance. Our view is that there is already a fantastic amount of work going on across the country, and the worry is that lots of them are duplicating each other. This will be from a neighbour who's providing a kid next door with some access to their Wi-Fi or a device or something, through to county-wide organisations, through to regional and sub-regional partnerships, responding to digital poverty across the divide, by the way. And of course, it's not just school children. So we have to be mindful that there are other people out there with other priority, who consider there to be other priorities beyond school children, and that the partnership is designed to do exactly what you're talking about, is to bring people together. We plan to provide some leadership. We plan to provide a platform whereby people can share the information, so that people who want to respond to this, because I think it's probably better to enable lots of local organisations and regional organisations to respond to the problem, rather than trying to force a national national answer on this, because as we've seen, the DFE, the answer is kind of part of the answer, but not all of the answer. I'm an absolute believer in technology and the difference it can bring into children's lives and the way they are motivated to engage, from the very brightest children to the least brightest. It's the least brightest that I like to focus on, and my view at the moment is that the reason why those children are disconnected from education, the ones who are struggling with data poverty, is not because they don't have a device. That is certainly part of it. But giving them a device is not going to suddenly change their attitude to education. They are disconnected for myriad different reasons, and so there are some fundamental things which need to change. Having said that, if it's properly implemented, children getting a device for the first time can hugely change the way they engage with education. So I'll drop you all a line about the Institution of Engineering and Technology at some point, and hope that we could encourage you to join at some point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, so I'm going to say that we've got in terms of areas of promise and action, we've talked about establishing clarity of purpose and focusing on the right things. What are we actually trying to use that digital access to do? We've got collaboration between sectors, models for partnership and so on. We've talked about networks between schools to reduce some of the isolation that is resulting in some schools having more difficulty than others in adopting and adapting. We've got the question of training and support to go beyond the devices and so on, and that links to school leadership to help that happen. We've got questions around access to data to understand the needs and what's working. We've got potential of incentives and similar things, so both tax relief and zero rating of websites and so on. And we've got the underlying kind of things we can do to reduce the poverty that sits at the heart of that. So that's a really helpful list for everyone to be thinking about and taking action on.
I'm the one not on mute. Off mute. Yeah. To complete the set. Yeah. Just thank you. Really, a really fascinating discussion, and thank you all for the kind of the perspectives and energy you brought. Really grateful for your time and for the conversation. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. Really appreciate your time. I know it's a busy time for everyone, so it's great to have you all together. And I look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.